Hello everyone, my name's Koenraad and I'm a lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, and I would like to welcome you to this little conversation starter for the second event in this series, Scottish Cosmopolitanism at the fin de siècle. The second event, as you know, is dedicated to the history of Scottish cosmopolitanism, and I hope to get a debate going about this by perhaps counterintuitively calling your attention to views on cosmopolitanism held abroad. As you can probably tell, I'm an avid channel hopper, and I would like to invite you along to Flanders for about 10 or 12 minutes, so I can talk you through some conflicting notions about cosmopolitanism held there that I hope may shed some light on the theme in Scotland. Just so you know what's coming, here is a short abstract. As you obviously know, Scottish cosmopolitanism in the fin de siècle was often explicitly Francophile. And if you need the background on those French connections, I can hardly recommend Professor Sean Reynolds' book on the subject. What you will also know is that one of the most prominent theorists of cosmopolitanism in Scotland at the time was William Sharp, who was mentioned already a few times in our last session. And Sharp was very interested in Francophone Belgian literature for how the peripheral Belgian authors managed to stand their ground against the dominant cultural center of Paris, while still insisting on their own particular national identity. And Sharp seems to have seen therein a cultural political strategy that could potentially be transposed to Scotland as well. Michael Shaw knows all about that. In particular, the adaptation of Flemish, originally Dutch-speaking Belgian authors to French literary culture was of interest to him. Within Belgium, at the same time, a heated debate was raging between such Flemish authors writing in French and their Dutch language counterparts. Now, I propose that this conflict reveals that there are several ways to do cosmopolitanism, and that this insight may offer some context for Sharp's adoption of the Francophone Belgium model. Before any of this can make sense, I need to give you some history on language issues in 19th century Belgium. As anything related to this country, this is a complex and multifaceted problem, but here it is condensed to one slide. After the French were vanquished at Waterloo in 1815, the area commonly known as the Southern Low Countries joined the North in what came to be known as the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The situation only lasted for 15 years, as in 1830 we had the Belgian Revolution, through which the southern provinces became the new state of Belgium. The revolutionaries had several reasons for rising against the Dutch, but the insurgents was mainly supported by a French-speaking bourgeois faction who'd always resented Dutch rule and found rattachism to France even more attractive. Now that country had recently witnessed the installation of the more liberal July monarchy. And on the other hand, there was the Catholic Church, who were troubled about the Dutch trying to disrupt the age-old Catholic religious dominance in the south, and both these factions were united in their disapproval of the balance of power laying in the north. The Radichists didn't get their desired annexation to France, although the French were certainly game, because Britain wanted a buffer state between the Netherlands and France instead. But, despite the demographic majority of Dutch speakers, the new Belgian regime became institutionally monolingually French, and this made speaking French prestigious, and insisting on Dutch in any context made it practically impossible to gain any position of political or cultural power. The famous French poet Charles Baudelaire was in exile in Brussels for a while and absolutely hated it for what he perceived to be its vulgar attempt to emulate French culture. He recorded in his notebook in 1864 that the Brussels bourgeoisie don't speak French, nobody does, but everyone affects not knowing Flemish. This is a sign of good taste. To prove that they know very well is that they scold their domestics in Flemish. And the term Flemish rather than Dutch is important here, as the common people all spoke dialects of Dutch rather than the standardized version of the North, and only educated Flemings attempted to standardize themselves slightly, but usually did this by adapting the local idiom to the Northern register slightly in a tradition known as particularism, which made it impossible for the Flemish to claim cultural validity by being part of the Dutch-speaking world. For much of the 19th century, Flemish literature in Dutch was limited to antiquarianism and newspaper verse, and the only internationally known author was probably Hendrik Conscience, whose Lion of Flanders is a national epic modeled on the historical romance of Walter Scott, which was quite well received in Victorian Britain. Things were different for those authors willing to write in French, who predominantly came from the French-speaking bourgeoisie, for whom, as said, French was a token of prestige, and they would also have had the benefit of an education in French, as after primary school there was no Dutch language education at the time. Several authors, whose parents or at least grandparents would only have spoken Dutch, made an international reputation for themselves writing in French, and some of the names given here will probably ring a bell. Charles de Coster wrote historical fiction taken after Victor Hugo, which was all based on Middle Dutch Flemish sources, but written in French, for instance La Légende d'Ulenspiegel et Lamme Goedzak. The naturalist novelist Camille Lemonnier was chummy with the likes of Zola, and wrote only in French, despite having spoken Dutch with his mother every day while growing up. And the same goes for another naturalist, Georges Eekhout, who was a best-selling novelist all over Europe, and even Emile Verhaeren, with his many poems about lusty Flemish peasant girls, never wrote a word in Dutch. Such authors invariably identified as ethnically Flemish, but had no qualms with the linguistic status quo in the young Belgian state, and saw themselves as competing within a wider French literary field in the same way as other regionally distinct subfields within Francophone literature. The acclaimed symbolist little magazine La Jeune Belgique declared in 1892, "We are French authors. Authors of a Breton, Norman, or Provençal strain have their own accent. We believe that the authors from Belgium also have theirs." Within Belgium, such identification with French literary culture often was paired with a disdain for Flemish as a language of culture that may be surprising given the fact that these authors describe themselves as ethnically Flemish and set their novels within Flanders or in Flemish history. Lemonnier, for instance, noted that Le Flamand would be the poor man of human idioms, an inferior language reserved for domestic necessities. The later Nobel Prize winner Maurice Maeterlinck spoke French with a Flemish accent all his life, but could get very worked up about Flemish authors insisting on writing in their own language about Flemish subjects. It is that amorphous and muddy jargon that they would dip the soul of Flanders into. Maeterlinck was from Ghent, and when the local university where I got my PhD was going to switch to tuition in Dutch, Maeterlinck signed a furious manifesto against this, as Flemish would not be a language of culture. Similarly, when a law was passed in 1898 that allowed for parliamentary debate to take place in Dutch as well as in French, the poet Emile Verhaeren saw herein an attack on the integrity of the Belgian nation. Flemish is the language of certain provinces, French of the country. The fatherland is in peril when French is. As you will know, the Scottish literary activist William Sharp was intent on the cultural emancipation of Scotland from a coercive British literary culture, but one that would still allow Scottish culture to reposition itself within a wider transnational framework instead of becoming provincialist. He was a great admirer of Francophone Belgian literature and, for instance, featured it in the Evergreen, and he agreed with La Jeune Belgique that it definitely preserved its national element while still functioning within the French literary field of its day, which according to him and other Scottish Francophiles was the benchmark of artistic innovation. The Belgians claim that they are producing a national literature. Many influential French critics refuse to acknowledge this Belgic literary output as anything more than the transfrontier radiation of the central luminary. Other and not less trustworthy students declare that meanwhile, Belgic literature is a dependent ally, still an ally, not lineal progeny, and that ere long it will probably become as distinctly and recognizably national as it possible for any literature expressed in a language which is its own by adoption only or through complex accident. Proud of having maintained steadfastly the demands of the fundamental laws of French poetry without hurt to or transformation of those particular aspects and methods of thought and sentiment characteristic of every patriotic Belgian, the legacy of his race, of his northern climate, and of that particular condition which has given his country an intermediate situation between the most powerful, as well as the most occidental of the Latin peoples, and the most potent of the Germanic races. Maeterlinck had earlier in his career flirted a little bit with his Flemish identity in order to make himself an exotic in the French literary field, as Sharp recalls there as well. At that date, 1886, Maeterlinck was so exigent in the matter of his Flemish nationality that he signed his poems and articles Maurice Maeterlinck. The Maurice came later when he found that a Belgian wrote and spoke a universal language, and a Fleming, what from a broad standpoint can be only called a provincial dialect. Sharp appears to pick up on what comparatists sometimes call microcosmopolitanism. Lagua and Verbrugge have written recently about the ambiguous national element in French language Flemish literature and discern such a strategy here, and perhaps this is an equally valid term for what Sharp himself was aiming for. In many respects, the practices and attitudes that have been discussed here were microcosmopolitan as defined by Michael Cronin. They did not involve the opposition of smaller political units to larger political units, national, transnational. Instead, a broader cosmopolitan context helped to diversify or complexify the smaller unit. French-speaking Belgian authors adopted a double strategy. Their purpose was to enlarge and protect their market by playing both the national and the Parisian card. This insistence on marketing lingo sounds a little bit cynical maybe, but the same could apply to cultural emancipation politics as well. It's kind of a strategy of having your Belgian waffle and eating it. By positioning yourself in a wider literary field, you gain cultural validity, but if you do this while subtly distinguishing yourself, you can attract international attention for your specific culture. In his article, Sharp discussed Belgian, or in his archaic phrase, Belgic literature, and although in the article he does acknowledge that there is a tradition of Dutch language, or at least Flemish language Belgian literature, he's clearly uninterested in anything that isn't written in French. This no doubt because he believed that Flemish literature was provincial and thereby not cosmopolitan. However, earlier in the same year that he published his encomium on La Jeune Belgique, another literary magazine was founded that did attempt to articulate a version of cosmopolitanism that would be compatible with the retention of the Dutch language. That journal is pictured here in its typical Art Nouveau cover, designed by the later renowned architect Henri van der Velde. Even if you read Dutch, you probably couldn't make out its intricately designed title here from the image, but it's called Vonduenstrax. This translates to Of Now and Later, a title explained in the mission statement in the first issue of April 1893. Vonduenstrax has a twofold purpose. It is mainly the journal of the youth of the southern Netherlands, an expression of the will and thought of the new generation. Without aesthetic dogmas, without schools, a free avant-garde organ devoted to the arts of now, curious about art in progress, that of later, here and abroad. This publication is also a work of book art, materially delivered by artists, in which as little as possible will be left to industrial production. There are a few things that need unpacking here. For starters, the mention of the southern Netherlands means that his journal rejected the linguistic and cultural particularism that to a large extent had isolated Flemish literature within Belgium, not allowing it to benefit from a wider cultural association with the Netherlands, which could effectively have shut up those critics who claimed that theirs was not a language of culture. You will no doubt also have noted the similarity in tone with that of British little magazines of the period, which also often claimed open-mindedness with an underlying political and/or aesthetic agenda. The aforementioned Henri van der Velde acted as its designer and claimed inspiration from the arts and crafts movement, and its later issues, especially the magazine, has a lot of affinity with the Century Guild hobby horse, for instance, but also with the evergreen. I'm pandering to the crowd here slightly by giving you a pretty image of a thistle, which I hope you appreciate. Now, the similarities with the evergreen do not end here, and I can't help but think that it's a shame that Sharp probably didn't know about this journal. Editor Auguste Vermeerle frequented the anarchist circles around the Brussels-based geographer Élisée Reclus, who was a collaborator of Patrick Geddes, and even a contributor to the Evergreen on one occasion, and Geddes and Company published a book of anarchist theory by Reclus's brother Paul as well. The magazine's message was prominently influenced by communitarian anarchism. Bakunin is another reference, for instance, and it often reported on events in both Flemish nationalist politics and in the international labour movement from this perspective. For instance, Vermeulen's essays, Critique of the Flemish Movement, calls for an avoidance of romanticization of linguistic politics for its own sake, in favor of an outward-looking communitarianism that emphasizes a historically rooted common language as a means of giving more social cohesion to society. Those of you with an interest in Gaelic, activism will probably recognize a lot of the arguments there. Similarly, the essay Flemish and European Movement calls for a form of cosmopolitanism where national identity is a starting point for confident and peaceful and equal interaction with other European nations. And this lack of provincialism can be attested in the other contents as well. The magazine, for instance, published a special issue with hitherto unknown letters by the recently deceased Vincent van Gogh, and featured original artwork by the then internationally famous Dutch symbolist Jan Toorop, by the famous Charles Ricketts, and by Ricketts's French collaborator Lucien Pizarro, and both of the latter featured prominently in British little magazines The Dial and The Pageant at the time. Vermeulen's essay Flemish and European Movement was written in response to a recent article by the Flemish naturalist author Cyril Buijsen, who, after having started a career writing in Dutch, had switched to French. Buijsen's article was about the same linguistic equality laws that Verhaeren had condemned before, and indeed both authors were supporting an organization that advocated the sole teaching of French to working-class Flemish children as a means of improving their social mobility. Vermeulen doesn't just polemicize against the anti-Dutch Buijsen. Instead, he argues for a reformation within the Flemish movement that would protect it against allegations of provincialism by shifting its focus away from linguistic politics for its own sake, as I said before, but also from the fetishization of the past and its historical cliches. What business have we with the past? Conditions change from age to age, and we ourselves want to shape history. The goal of Flemish cultural emancipation would not be merely getting to speak one's language, let alone writing lofty heroic poetry about knights who died 600 years ago. It's actually a means of confidently entering international debates and demanding a place amongst the nations. As particularism should never become a barrier to the higher unity of a common Netherlandish civilization, so that civilization too shall be a living part in its own right of the global culture of the European races. Instead of being second-race emulators of French norms, we should strive for a distinct Flemish identity, argues Vermeulen, because this gives us a perspective from which to approach issues that are of concern to the whole continent. And his article ends with a formula that is still widely known in Flanders today. To be something, we must be Flemings. We wish to be Flemings in order to become Europeans. We willen Vlamingen zijn om Europeërs te worden. I'd like to conclude by reading a bit to you from a letter written to the Dutch labor activist Domela Nieuwenhuis, which appeared in the magazine in 1896, and this is by Vermeulen as well. Maar hier vallen de woorden, hier mag alleen de kunst ons vermoeden uitstamelen. Misschien komt er een tijd dat wij ook in zonnige vreugd zullen groeien en het levend vlees van het mensdom werken. Nu moeten we wachten. Door de kunst wordt de liefde mogelijker op aarde. Mijn vriend, we zullen dit land schoner maken. There. I'm sure I went over time a little bit, but I'm just too into this topic. Here are a few things that I would love to chat about on the 30th. First of all, what do you think about microcosmopolitanism as a strategy for participation in global discussions for smaller nations? That could apply to both French language and Dutch language literature in Belgium, and maybe to Sharp's strategy for Scotland as well. La Jeune Belgique claimed a peripheral identity within international Francité or French culture in order to gain an audience for itself and call attention to its individuality. Vonduenstrax reconnected to the Netherlands for similar reasons and wanted to use this Netherlandish orientation as a stepping stone towards an even wider conversation. Finally, I wonder whether Vonduenstrax isn't ideologically closer to the evergreen than, say, the francophone Flemish authors favored by Sharp. To what extent did Sharp actually himself propagate the literature of locality for which Geddes repeatedly argued in the evergreen? What about the individuality of Scots in its many forms, be it Lowland or Doric or Shetland? And what about residual elements of Norn culture in Orkney or Gaelic culture in the Highlands? It would be interesting to know to what extent cosmopolitan cultures can accommodate such inherent diversity, as some of the francophone Flemish authors barely tolerated the language of their own grandparents.